Good morning and welcome. My name is Munir Kudus. I serve as the Dean of the College of Business at Prairie View A&M University. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to this program. I will serve as the moderator today. Today, we expect to have an intellectually stimulating discussion about the state of the US economy and its future outlook. I would say it's a timely and highly relevant discussion for our students, faculty, members of the advisory board, and the guests who have joined us today. I believe this discussion is going to elevate the economic and financial IQ and literacy for all of us. As a business school that is accredited with AACSB International, and one that is proud to offer the newest doctoral program in business in the state of Texas, we are always eager to bring in thought leaders, business leaders, policymakers to the campus to interact with our students and the campus community. Students, the pursuit of a degree is important, but the real benefit of a college education is in programs like this, which help you enhance your understanding of the world, make you a more curious individual, and a more informed citizen. I commend you for joining the program today. I hope you take careful notes and ask questions. Yes, there will be an opportunity to ask live questions of our guests today, so please be prepared. I will provide further instructions later. Now for the introductions. Today, we have two very special guests on the panel today. Rob Kaplan, the president of Federal Reserve Bank Dallas, and Ruth Simmons, president, Prairie View A&M University. They're both outstanding leaders in their own fields. Mr. Kaplan completed his undergraduate studies as a business major and went on to complete an MBA from the Harvard Business School. He started his career in the private sector, working at Goldman Sachs for 23 years, and then came back to academia, serving as an administrator in the Harvard Business School before he joined the public sector at the Fed. Our second guest today needs no introduction to this group. Ruth Simmons is one of the most prominent and sought-after academic leaders in the country today. Most recently, she received the 2021 Theodore Hesburgh Award for Leadership Excellence in Higher Education. This award is given annually to a university president or chancellor for outstanding leadership in higher education. That is why we claim to have the best president in the country with us today. I had an opportunity to sit with Dr. Simmons when she arrived on the campus to discuss leadership issues. I remember one comment she made, that one should always be open to meeting new people and attending events like this, because you never know what someone would say is going to change your life forever. That is a good advice for all of us, including our students. Without further ado, please help me welcome President Simmons and Mr. Rob Kaplan. President Simmons.
Thank you, Dean Kudus. Rob, we are so delighted and honored to have you with us today for a discussion on the economy. Thank you for coming virtually to Prairie View. We look forward to engaging the audience's questions afterwards. I want to especially welcome members of the Houston branch of the Fed who have joined the call also. And I always want to say a warm welcome to our students. Rob, I thought that we might start with some questions about the Texas economy, but I first want to give you an opportunity to make some general comments about how you're thinking about the state of affairs today with the economy.
So, as you all know painfully well, we're in the midst of a resurgence in the COVID virus, and particularly the Delta variant. And so, what we're seeing, and we've been seeing for the last number of weeks, is weakness, particularly in travel, leisure, hospitality, and as a result of some of the weakness we're seeing at the Dallas Fed, we have revised down our third quarter growth estimate. So we were expecting 6.5% GDP growth for the year. We're now more in the neighborhood of 6%. That's not a surprise in light of this resurgence. Our forecast for the fourth quarter is basically unchanged, though, and our forecast for next year, which is in the neighborhood of 3% growth, that's basically unchanged. So some of the surprising things we're seeing with this resurgence, though, is mobility and engagement. We track a whole range of high frequency data to figure out credit card spending, trips, what people are doing. And while we have not seen an improvement in mobility engagement, and we had hoped for it earlier in the year around now, we haven't seen a deterioration either. So it's been kind of constant. So what's that tell us? It tells us consumers and businesses are surprisingly resilient. They're adapting to COVID, not without some, difficulty, but they're adapting. And we've got more tools to help them adapt. We've got vaccines, we've got coming booster shots, use of masks is a key tool, testing is a key tool, other protocols, and people are aggressively using them. And they're going about their business. So we think that this recovery is continuing in the economy, but it's going to go in fits and starts, and the fits and starts are going to be heavily related to where we are in the virus. And right now we're in a resurgence period. But fundamentally, I think our outlook at the Dallas Fed is that the economy is continuing to improve. One of the things, though, as a result of this resurgence, we're going to see is the matching of workers with jobs. This kind of resurgence slows it down. There are a record number of job openings in the United States. A little bit below 11 million job openings. That's a record. But we've got in the neighborhood of 3 million people who've self-identified as retired since February 2020. We've got 1.25 million people who are caregivers who've left the workforce, primarily women with children, understandable. Lack of schools being open in person, lack of availability of childcare, and personal choice to some extent. And we've got fear of infection, which is totally understandable. And I'm also hearing from businesses I talk to, absenteeism is higher than usual. And so all that takes away from capacity among people that are employed. And, everything we're seeing is the workforce is very tight. And it is hard to hire. Almost every business I talk to tells me stories about how they're paying more and still are struggling to find workers. They're cutting back a capacity and operations because they can't staff it. So you would think with that kind of demand, we'd see faster job growth, but I think the virus, cuts a little bit different direction. So we've seen a weaker job number in August. It wouldn't shock us to see the September job growth number a little bit disappointing because of this matching issue. But we think the direction is still improving. The other thing we're hearing from businesses is about costs. Material supply demand imbalances are persisting. Most businesses I talk to tell me, if anything, they're getting a little worse. They're extending the time frame when they think they're likely to get resolved for a whole range of reasons. And certainly the supply demand imbalances for workers is if anything, I think getting more pronounced. And so as a result of that, we're expecting headline inflation this year, PCE, personal consumption expenditures inflation, in the neighborhood of 4% for 2021, And our forecast right now at the Dallas Fed is it's going to be 2.6% next year. And I would guess the risk is to the upside. So the inflation, particularly, is more of a struggle if you're a small, mid-sized business. If you're a big business, you can use technology and other levers, scale, to manage it. If you're a small, mid-sized business, you may not have those levers, and the only way you can deal with it is to either is probably increase prices, and that's what people are doing. For consumers, again, if you're a low, moderate income family, these type of price pressures are taking a bigger chunk of your wallet. You know, gas, cars, eventually rents, you know, with this rising home prices. And so we're watching that very carefully. Our mandate at the Fed is full employment and price stability. And I think now it's important to focus on both aspects of that dual mandate. So let me stop there and then throw it back to you.
Wow, you've given us a lot in that brief period of time. Remembering, Rob, that many on the call are young people who've not experienced anything close to this before. I wonder if you'd do us the pleasure of thinking back over time in your storied career to what you've seen. And if you'd calibrate this period for them, how would you describe to them the magnitude of what this confluence of factors is all about?
So I'll contrast this to other downturns and recovery from other downturns, and this is very unusual compared to those. The most recent is the Great Recession, and many in your audience, while they were probably pretty young students were young in the Great Recession. The Great Recession was we had a lack of demand, and coming out of it, we had a lack of demand. And it took years for consumer balance sheets to get deleveraged, consumer spending to strengthen. We did not have anywhere near as much fiscal policy as we've had recently. And so we really had a number of years where it took a while for job demand to improve, demand generally to recover. This pandemic has been unusual in that we had a severe downturn in March. We had a rebound almost immediately in April, and we rebounded with fits and starts all through the year last year. And the rebound continues. And what we're seeing today is demand is actually very strong. In fact, if you took demand to consumer demand in February of 2020 and grew it at 2%, as if COVID never happened, we're actually growing faster right now. We have higher absolute demand than we would have if we just kept growing at 2%. Okay, so demand is really strong. It's been very strong for goods. It's starting to improve for services. With the resurgence, it's taken another step back, but there's plenty of demand, and there's an enormous amount of fiscal money, and a lot of the money we're finding from the American Rescue Act is not been spent. We've spent a lot of time talking to cities and states who have a substantial amount of money that they need to spend between now and the end of 24, and or they lose it. And so you've got a pretty good tailwind. Our problem is supply. And I don't think many of us have lived through a period where we had supply strains, at least not for many years. But that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a difficulty in matching supply and demand. That's unusual, and that's a very different situation than, say, the Great Recession or other downturns.
Thank you. So let's turn then to the Texas economy, which we're all, of course, especially interested in. What is your outlook for the energy and oil energy industry and oil markets? And how well is the energy industry adapting as the world becomes more focused on climate change?
So the energy industry faced a a supply and a demand shock last year, due to COVID. And then OPEC plus Russia dramatically increased supply. And so it affected, they had too much supply and then demand fell off. So you had a big shock negatively in the price. Since recovered, total production in the United States was 11 million barrels a day at year end. And what's happened though, is shareholders are far more insistent with producers that if they have cash flow, they use it for share repurchase and dividends and spend less of it on drilling. So we think net production growth this year in the United States may be in the neighborhood of say 11.3, 11.4. So pretty modest in light of the fact prices, are in the high 60s, low 70s.
Now, Rob, could you dig into that a little bit and explain to students why shareholder demand for reinvesting in companies is so prominent?
Yeah, so the oil industry has had a run for many years where shareholders have been disappointed with stock price performance. That's one issue. Second issue, you asked about climate change. There's a lot more activism trying to encourage some of these big companies to shift, to not invest more in oil and gas production, maybe to shift to other renewables and other things. And these oil companies are also spending a lot more on sequestration, carbon capture, and other techniques to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Those are very expensive. And so what shareholders are saying is, listen, we don't want to do what we've always done, which is you have cash flow, you put it in drilling. We're worried that maybe some of that drilling is going to be stranded in the years ahead because of move to alternatives. And also historically, when you have this big investment cycle in drilling, hasn't always worked out in terms of returns because then prices might come down. And so shareholders are saying, we're not going to go through this again. If you have cash flow, we want you to return more of it. And so that limits the money available for drilling. And also it's harder for these oil companies to attract lending and certainly hard to attract capital. So if they're going to drill, it's going to have to come out of cash flow, and they don't want to be leveraged because of the volatility of the commodity. And so that's the issue.
Got it.
Now,
okay.
Go ahead, please. You asked about climate change, and so we're in the midst of a meaningful transition globally to wind, solar, other alternatives, a lot of R&D in battery storage, other techniques. The issue for the United States and maybe for the world is while that transition is accelerating, there's a limit to how fast it can. There's a limit to how fast it can go. And while we're in the middle of this transition, which is going to take many years, you still have demand for fossil fuels. Now, a lot of people say, no, I'm not going to use fossil fuels. Well, if you buy a couch and you see it's got delayed 6 months, and why? It has to do with petrochemicals. It goes into petrochemicals, which goes in the resins in the couch. And so people don't always connect all the products they use every day and say, I'm not going to, I don't use that much oil. I don't use oil and gas. Well, yeah, you use more than you think you do.
Yeah.
And so that's a dilemma. And so the issue is, how do you keep a healthy fossil fuel industry and petrochemical industry, which we're going to need for more than the next couple of 3 years. We're going to need probably for the next couple of decades. And I think that's a challenge.
Unquestionably. You're always so forceful on the Texas economy. And so give us your overall outlook for the Texas economy.
So the Texas economy, on the one hand, the recovery from the downturn in the first quarter and the fits and starts kind of mirror the US economy. And you see some slowing in the US, you're probably going to see it in Texas. Obviously, the virus is regional right now, so that's affected Texas maybe more than other cities. But by and large, with some lags, the shape of the Texas recovery and economy mirrors the nation, except for one big difference, and that is migration of people and firms to the state. So the population of Texas is growing very aggressively. And we've gone from, say, 22 million people 10, 12 years ago to 29 now, on a way to a much higher number. And we take that for granted a little bit in Texas, but GDP growth is made up of growth in the workforce and growth in productivity. And if you've got population growth and you got migration of people and firms coming to where you live, it means you're going to outgrow places that have flat to down population growth. So Texas has a big tailwind. Now we have to manage this right. You need infrastructure. I won't get into it, but the social issues might affect people's desire to, how they think about migration and other issues. But by and large, Texas is got a great hand in that we're likely going to have faster population growth. We have for some time, and that's likely to continue for an extended period, which means we're going to grow faster.
How do you see education playing into the fate of the state in the coming years?
All right, so that's the next. So then back to, so how do we get the most out of this? Here's the problem or the challenge. The fastest growing demographic groups in the state are lagging in terms of educational attainment. And so it's critical if your workforce, a big part of your future workforce, Black citizens, Hispanics are lagging. We've got to do more in terms of early childhood literacy, secondary education, skills training, Prairie View, A&M. Education is the vehicle to improve the productivity, employability, and adaptability of the workforce. And that's it's one of the big opportunities for Texas, and it's one of the big challenges.
Thank you so much for always speaking to that issue. Of course, we try to encourage our families, our communities to support education at a very intensive level. And of course, that's the reason, because without investing in our children in the way that you suggest, we will have a very tough time of it maintaining a healthy economy. Let's move now to the national economy. Is there anything else that you wanted to say about that before we go on? I have some specific questions. Your assessment of the U.S. economic recovery, you've told us a bit about that. Now we are in the midst of amazing new developments with regard to COVID. I don't know. I mean, I've heard that there's a new variant, variant, for example. They're following the Greek alphabet. So in light of, I don't want you to ask you for worst case scenarios. I don't want to go there. But at the same time, we opened the year with a very significant number of student cases on our campus. And we've been triaging ever since we opened with individuals coming down with the infection. And I understand the president today is supposed to make some announcement about what the federal government can do in order to address the new challenges with COVID. But what do you see as the most important thing for policymakers to do to make sure that we don't have to shut down again because of infections?
So I'll start with vaccines. What we're watching very carefully here at the Dallas Fed is it's been the case, unfortunately, that vaccines do not necessarily mean you can't get COVID. Right. We're seeing the so-called breakthrough infections. But so far, what we're seeing is the vaccines have been very effective against hospitalization and more severe outcomes. We're watching that carefully. If that were to change, that would be a significant change. So far, we're not seeing that. And with the booster shots, for those who've been vaccinated at least 6-8 months ago, that should help improve resiliency. And then there's the issue of later in the year, will there be a vaccine approved for children less than a certain age? And that's critical because, that affects school age children and their ability to stay in school, and affects the, their parents and whether they can go work and all that. And so so then that gets to masks. So what are the tools we have? All I'll say is each of us has to make our own personal decision about whether or not we're going to get vaccinated. But I would emphasize, you just have to accept that's more than a personal decision. What we each decide affects the entire community, whether we like it or not. It does. And what we're seeing is, because there's some meaningful percentage of unvaccinated, you're seeing greater spread. To the extent there's greater spread, there's greater mutation. The greater the mutation, the greater the risk there's going to be one of these variants that isn't as susceptible to the vaccine. That's the risk. And so we're watching it carefully, but the more people are vaccinated, and the extent we can reduce spread, it's going to help. Then the second part is masks. We had masks, everybody was used to it. And then we had, for a brief period, of CDC guidance where we didn't need to wear them. And I think it's been a little hard for people to say, oh no, now we got to go back. And you notice it's just making that transition back. And then there's the whole debate, which I'll stay away from, on of is it mandatory or is it your own right? And the only comment I would make, and I'm thinking again of school children. So if you're in a confined space and you don't have a choice but to be there, and if half the class is unmasked and half is masked, just the odds of spread are greater. So yes, it is each of our personal right whether or not to wear a mask, but that decision doesn't affect just you, it affects everybody. And so in that regard, ironically, I don't know how much there is. This is, government's not going to, there's limits to what government can do. They can spend money, they can make vaccines available, make sure there's good distribution and all that. But there's no substitute that every individual in society is going to have to make decisions. And to the extent that we all do, that's the most powerful action I would think we could take, is what we do individually. That government can't do that for us, as you know.
Precisely. Just a word about the interventions of the government that have been so critical during this period. Is more fiscal release necessary at this point, do you think, or are actions taken to date sufficient to support continuing recovery? So
I'll be careful because I don't want to get out of my lane.
Right.
But listen, during 2020, certainly fiscal policy for the unemployed, eviction moratorium, a number of steps were vital to allow people to make ends meet, to allow them to have enough money to live. And it bolstered household income and it bolstered consumer spending. We're now getting to the point in the recovery where there's still 5.2% unemployed, and there's another few percent of the people that are, we look at something called U6, unemployed plus discouraged workers, people working part-time who want to work full-time. But I would say the demand, as we talked earlier, is very strong.
Mm-hmm.
It may be slowing somewhat, but that was bound to happen, but it's very strong. And there's significant demand for workers. It's the matching process. So, fiscal stimulus, I'm sure there are targeted areas of vulnerable groups, but we have a little bit of a different situation than we did, say, in 2020, early 21.
Okay. I think we're getting close to our Q&A period. So I want you to advise our students again. We have a campus full of hopeful students. Thank God for that. Like many of their generation, they worry about the financial future. You've been a professor. What can you say to young people about how to plan in times such as these?
So my best advice, especially for your students at where they are right now, is the most important thing you can do, which is not easy, is understand your strengths and weaknesses. What are you good at? Where do you need to improve? Second, what do you have a passion for? And many of the students don't know yet. And when I say passion, what kinds of tasks, what kinds of mission, what kind of environment? When were you at your best? When have you shined? Where do you shine in your life? Where you feel great? What do you learn about yourself, about the task, the environment, the people you're working with, the mission? And the trick is still to combine working on your strengths and weaknesses, trying to figure out what you have a passion for, and be thinking about jobs that combine those two. And the reason passion, I always say it's the rocket fuel that drives high performance, is whatever you're doing, you're going to have to work on your strengths and weaknesses for the rest of your life. Passion is what motivates you to do it. It's not always easy to do that, but if you have a passion for what you're doing, it pulls you through. And I think that's still, in terms of planning, don't worry about what's hot. Don't worry about what the future, hard to predict the future. But if you focus on understanding yourself in terms of your strengths and weaknesses and your passions, I think you'll get to where you'll get to a good place. And the one other piece of advice separately, read the newspaper every day. Either Wall Street Journal, local paper, but I think there's no substitute for being better informed and reading the paper every day.
And you're being with us and speaking to our students. That's evidence of how important it is for them to do that. Rob, I want to put that phrase that you mentioned in front of our students somehow prominently. Passion is the rocket fuel that drives
high performance.
High performance.
That's right.
I love that. And so I'm going to try to develop more passion myself so that
you seem to have a lot of it.
So I can do that. So I understand now we need to go to Munir for questions from the audience. Thank you so much for being open to just receiving questions directly from the audience. So Munir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Simmons and Mr. Kaplan, for that very enlightening conversation. I'm sure there are a lot of questions from the audience, so we'll get to it. Before we take the first question, I'd like to share some guidance for those who want to ask questions in a live mode. Once you have your question, please raise your digital hand to alert us. There are about 200 people on the call today, so it might take me some time to get to you, but I will select and call on the audience member by name, at which time you will be unmuted and you can ask your question verbally to either of our guests. So let's get started. So far, I don't see any digital hand raised, but I do see some questions in the chat box. So let me ask one of those questions. This is from Hissam Shahriari. He's a professor of finance at the university. Question is, what is your opinion on the expected inflation considering worker shortage, supply chain disruptions, and loose monetary policy? Do you believe inflation to be transitory?
My concern is, based on what I'm seeing, is the supply-demand imbalances for materials, I think, are going to last longer than some people are expecting. Semiconductors might be a good example, in that investment in semiconductors is going up dramatically, but demand for semiconductors is growing even faster. And by the way, we talked about climate change. Electrification of the auto grid creates much greater demand for semiconductors. Migration to the cloud computing takes more semiconductors. And so I think, and we got a lot of demand. So that's on that side. On the wage side, based on everything I'm hearing, I don't have it's hard to think of a conversation I have with a business person who's not telling me they're dramatically increasing their wages. And by the way, then they go on to say, even with that, they can't find workers, and they're probably going to have to do more. So I think these labor supply demand imbalances are going to be with us for some extended period of time. So that makes me think that you're going to see some broadening in price pressures going into next year. Some of these extreme moves, we may see moderate used car prices, others, but our sense at the Dallas Fed, based on our work, is that price pressures are likely broadening. And so that's the extent I said 2.6% PCE inflation next year. There's risk to the upside on that based on what we're seeing right now.
Thank you. We have a question from Melanie Price. She's a professor, endowed professor on campus. And she's asking, last year, there was a lot of talk about racial reckoning in America that would impact diversity efforts in all sectors. How do you think businesses will address this in the continuing pandemic economy?
So I'll make the observation, diversity, equity, and inclusion for many businesses, if not most of them, is central to the effort to attract, retain, and develop your workforce. In other words, it used to be maybe there was attract, retain, develop, and then, oh yes, there was diversity, inclusion. And today, I think you can't have one without the other. So that's one part. Second part is when you talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, you talk about embedded barriers, early childhood literacy, access to healthcare, other impediments that make it harder for there to be a level playing field. And I think there's a much greater recognition that those exist, a willingness to call them out, and an understanding that we probably need to do more to level the playing field. The term equity is a relatively newer term, at least to me. It's talked about much more broadly, and it's leveling the playing field and getting at some of these embedded issues. Access to lending in low, moderate income communities, another issue. These are all challenges we have. They're not easy to address, but I think there's a lot greater focus in society on that. But these don't get fixed overnight or addressed. This is going to be multi-year persistent effort to address these.
Thank you. Well, the number of raised hands. So first we'll go to Mahmoud Orian. You are unmuted, Mahmoud. Please ask your question.
Thank you very much. What if mutations affect the booster dose vaccination adversely, and will then Malthus's theory turn into a reality?
Thank you.
So if I understand you correctly, how will boosters, if they're not effective, if it turns out the vaccine is less effective on mutations, and the thing I'd be looking at again is hospitalizations and more severe outcomes, that's going to be a big challenge. And what I hear from people, infectious disease experts, doctors, is then you're going to have probably a sprint to retool these vaccines and try to adapt them to the new variant. But that doesn't happen overnight, and that's going to take some time. But it's possible that that's a scenario that will need to happen.
Thank you. The next question is from Trinity. Trinity, you are unmuted. Please ask your question.
Okay. Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So my question is in reference to the unemployment rate. So my question is, why do you think the unemployment rate is still high? And what implications does this have for young people like me who would graduate from college and be looking for a job soon?
And how's it going?
I haven't started quite yet.
Okay. And can I ask one other question? What kind of job are you looking for?
It would probably be more in the financial field. I'm actually a returning student who was laid off in December
Got it.
because of the pandemic. So I decided to come back to school to finish my degree.
Okay.
So it'll probably be leaning more towards a financial institution or something of that nature, which is where I came from when
Right.
I decided to go back in the work field.
All right. So here's the issue. I mentioned earlier, on paper at least, and this is the so-called JOLTS report, there's a record number of open jobs. The issue for you and everybody else is you're not looking for 10 million jobs, you're looking for one job, and you're likely looking in an area. And so this gets to the matching between the job you're looking for that fits your skills, strengths and weaknesses, your passions, and is that job available? And that takes time. And obviously you've taken an important step to enhance your ability to improve that matching by going back to school. I assume that's why you did it. But what we're seeing is this matching process doesn't happen instantaneously. It's a process and it takes time, and that's what we're seeing. So I'd be optimistic, Trinity, when you go out there, you're going to find a job. The issue is going to be, is exactly the job you want? Is it a good fit? There are plenty of jobs. The challenge will be, is the matching, does it match something you want to do?
Thank
Rob,
you.
Munir,
Please.
if I could just
Please.
ask, do you have the sense, Rob, that in looking for jobs today, that not just looking at salaries and wages, but that people are being much more selective in what they are prepared to do for a job? And is that part of the issue? And what would you say to someone who is going through a series of opportunities, none of which is appealing to them? Should they just start somewhere and develop some experience, or what advice would you give?
So what we're finding pretty broadly is a job that might have been acceptable to you pre-pandemic may not be acceptable now. Why is that? Cost of living is higher.
Right.
If you made $12 to $15 an hour, this is at the lower end before, you might need to feel you make 18 plus or minus now. That's number one. Number two, certain sectors are still sluggish in reopening, particularly in the service sector. And that's just a fact of life. And so it wouldn't surprise me that people looking, they're finding options, but to your point, Ruth, at some point, maybe they have enough accumulated savings, they can be more patient, but at some point they're going to have to make a decision. And that's kind of what we're seeing. But people have more savings. There was more fiscal support. There's been a lot of talk about the unemployment benefits, but I think that's just a part of the puzzle. And depending on your health and your health conditions, this resurgence might also be giving you some pause, and causing you to want to wait. So those are all factors. Yeah. But people are making decisions and they're choosing jobs, but it's a process, and if we're seeing it takes time.
I'm just wondering if that is what's happening, whether we're going to see, as we get further into the recovery, more shifting. One of the things that, as an employer, that I have often worried about is the job hopping that I see.
Yeah.
Because from my experience, by remaining in place in a job for a period of time, you get real experience, depth of experience, which makes you far more marketable in the long run. And are we likely to see people jumping from job to job as this continues?
We're already seeing it. The quits rate is historically high. I mean, the rate at which people are quitting. So absolutely. And we hear from employers, listen, I hired somebody, they stayed for a very short period of time, and then they left. And there's a whole discussion among, you pick the industry, where people are saying, I've got somebody who's been working for me. They don't want to come into the office now. They want to work remotely. They don't want to drive out to me. And they're getting lots of offers, 100% remote at big increases over what we're paying them. So the job market is tight and there's lots of demand. And many workers are saying, I don't want to go into the office 5 days a week. I don't want to go in the office at all. And so what was acceptable to me here, I don't want to do this. And they're getting offers. And so we're seeing this.
Yeah.
And so employers are trying to figure out, how do you keep your people? How do you, I want to press people to come in there, but I don't want to press too hard. I'm going to lose them. And we're hearing all those conversations.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we have 4 more hands and about 10 minutes to go. We'll try to get to all the questions. Zadrian Robinson. Zadrian, you are unmuted. Please ask your question.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
My question is, which occupations do you see having a higher demand in the future?
Which occupation have higher demand in the future? That's a heck of a good question. Obviously, anything related to technology, I would say, is going to be never-ending demand. I would have thought engineering, technology, but I got to tell you, I think the bigger question, and I always say this to people your age, students, is don't worry about it. One, you won't accurately predict it. And number 2, figure out where you have a passion, figure out what your strengths and weaknesses are, and then find something that fits it. It may not be the hot job or the hot industry, but it may turn out to be fantastic. And if you have a passion for it, or conversely, don't go into what's hot, but you don't love, because you're going to run out of gas. And so it still comes down to you. And I whatever prediction I gave you on what the hot jobs are going to be, the only thing I know for sure is I'm going to be wrong.
Munir.
We had a power outage here. I don't know if you can hear.
Okay.
The next question is Davian Milan. Davian, you are unmuted.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I just had a question. So since the pandemic has started, we've seen a lot of CARES Act and stimulus checks. And like you said, the job market is really open because people are like, I can get my stimulus or my CARES Act without going to the job because, the employers, they don't really care about their workers much by not making everybody wear a mask or even doing sick leave pay. So do you think, since there's a lot of jobs open, do you think they're gonna cut back on the CARES and stimulus checks so people be more motivated to go back to work, even though some employers aren't treating their workers that well?
So some of that's already happening.
Yeah.
And some of this is going to run off. It may not speed the matching process as much as people are thinking. So a lot of people thought, oh my Lord, once we get to September and some of the unemployment runs off and schools are reopening, now we're going to see a big surge. I don't know about that. I think there's a lot of other pieces to the puzzle. And fear of infection is one of them. Personal choice is another. And people have a fair amount of accumulated savings, which allows them to be patient. So we're seeing all that. And yeah, the money is going to eventually, I don't know, it was going to run off, but it may, this matching process still might be time consuming.
Thank you. Next is Maya Cummings. Maya, you're unmuted. Please ask your question.
Maya, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hello? Okay.
Yes.
So when I
let me,
started
Maya,
work,
Maya,
yes.
I'm sorry, but I have to tell Rob that you are a very distinguished alumna of Prairie View, a public policy person who worked alongside your husband, Elijah, for many years. Thank you so much for your service, for all that you've been doing for your country. I just had to say that, but go ahead with your question.
So Dr. Simmons, thank you for your leadership. And Rob, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. This was a fascinating discussion. I've done a lot of work at the national level on the racial wealth gap. And when I started the work in the early 2000s, we saw African Americans take a hit from the financial lending crisis. And then they took a hit from the global financial crisis. They never recovered from that before we got hit by this COVID crisis. And so when I started the work, the numbers were for every $1 of wealth held by the typical white family, the African American family had about 14 cents. Now it's about 6 cents. And it's actually getting worse. And so earlier, when Dr. Price asked about the racial reckoning, you kind of alluded to some structural issues with regards to race. I'm wondering if you could go a bit further and tell me your sensibility about whether we're looking at a fix being in the realm of public policy, practice, or both. And do you think that this racial wealth gap issue is going to create structural imbalances in the future, given the changing demographics of the nation?
Yeah, so Maya, thank you. And thank you for your leadership. The racial wealth gap, a lot of people talk about it as it would be a nice thing to deal with. My own view, and Ruth has heard me say this, GDP growth, as I said earlier, is growth in the workforce and growth in productivity. If we don't improve the ability of the fastest growing demographic groups to be more fully participating in capitalism, we're just going to grow more slowly. And by the way, it's one thing to say that these groups are the fastest growing groups when they're a small percentage of the population, but they're not. They're a very large percentage. This is a big part of the future workforce of Texas for sure, and of the country. And so this is a business thing. This is in our interest. This is human capital. And the thing to me still, it starts with reading to children 0 to 5, improving early childhood literacy, access to childcare, affordable childcare, which is not great, improving secondary education, even if you're in a zip code where the tax revenues, are such that you're not getting enough to the money to the school, skills training. It's this whole ecosystem. And for me, it's if you want to be selfish, all of us, if we don't improve it, we're going to grow more slowly. There's no getting around it. And we're going to be less productive. We're going to have slower workforce growth. And this includes access to healthcare too, by the way, where you need a healthy workforce and an educated and adaptable workforce. And we are struggling on both fronts. So I think this is now then the question, what do you do about it? And so, yes, there's the federal government, but I have found why this is so challenging. A lot of this progress needs to be done locally. Early childhood literacy, got to be done locally. And it may not even be the government. It may be, I used to be part of an early childhood literacy program called Everybody Wins, where I read to a child a couple times a week, during his lunch hour. Business leaders, citizens need to get involved in nonprofits. We all need to do things to work on different parts of this ecosystem. Businesses are already paying for a lot of skills training. And oh, by the way, post-pandemic, what I hear is skills training, junior college enrollment is down. And so a lot of this has to be done locally. And I'd say everybody on this call, all of us, have to take ownership of this and not wait for the federal government, may not even wait for the state government. There are a lot we can do. Citizens and businesses can do a lot, but it may involve volunteering, et cetera, because this is a burning issue.
Thank you. I see a few more hands, but unfortunately we have run out of time. I do want to thank our guests, Robert Kaplan and Ruth Simmons, for a very informative and wide-ranging conversation. on the US economy and related topics. We're also grateful to everyone who was able to join us today. Thanks also to the staff at the Dallas Fed and Prairie View A&M University who worked very hard behind the scenes to make this program a success. Before I conclude, back to Dr. Simmons for some closing remarks.
Munir, thank you for moderating so ably. We very much appreciate your leadership of business here. Oh my, Rob, honestly, this has been terrific from my perspective. The opportunity, what I was thinking for a moment is that we talk a lot about interdisciplinarity in universities, as you know, but you're sitting in a spot where you get to see and hear everything about the ecosystem. And it must be fascinating for you. I mean, what an opportunity. Although it's very difficult circumstances, it must feel terrific to be able to receive all of this knowledge. So you've benefited us greatly today. It's not often that we have someone with your knowledge and experience who can take so much time to share your perspectives and expertise with our educational community. So to that point, I just want to say how deeply grateful I am to you for being with us today. And of course, we always welcome future opportunities to partner. I just want to say that from the moment that I landed back in Texas and at Prairie View, you have reached out and you've always been there to encourage and to say how important it is, the work that we do in education and in HBCUs, how important that is. We don't have a lot of policymakers who get that. So I have to thank you for that, truly. And then before we end, if you have any parting remarks for the audience, feel free to share a few words.
So I'd say again, thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Munir. What you're doing at Prairie View and your student body, it's, I mean, I come from education before I came to the Fed. It's critical to the country. It's critical to the state. Education is the key in the years ahead. How well we do and how well Prairie View flourishes and the whole ecosystem we just talked about is going to be central to how well the country does. And so thank you to you and Munir for your leadership and all that you're doing. It's essential to the future of Texas and the United States.
Thanks, Rob. Thank you to our audience, to my students. Thank you for joining in. And we'll say have a good day.